Jesus said to them, "You don't need to send them away. You give them something to eat." Sounds impossible. Sounds like too much. I'm sure they were feeling overburdened, overextended, overworked, and at this point, far overwhelmed. Jesus was asking his disciples to do the impossible. Why was he asking them to do this? It's clear he wanted them to see their inabilities. And he wanted them to see the God who always provides and meets all their needs. That they would not be overwhelmed if they would first just listen to what he was asking them to do and trusted in him to provide.
This message is from Rock and Vage's Lutheran Church in Payson, Arizona, August 2nd, 2026, Matthew 14:13-21.
Have we bitten off more than we can chew? Surveys indicate that of Americans polled, many of them feel that they are overwhelmed. Over 70% report feeling completely exhausted or overburdened or overstretched, and they report this feeling several times a week. That's something, isn't it? That we're one of the most well-provisioned, secure societies in all of history, and yet we can feel overextended and worry about what's next. And yet that's not new, and that's not simply something that we face in our nation, is it? That's something that people across the world face. It seems like everybody is always feeling overextended and weary and worried and overwhelmed. So are Christians any different in this regard? Today we look at Jesus in Matthew 14, teaching his disciples and teaching us why we never need to feel overwhelmed. And if ever there was a time in Jesus' ministry when he and his disciples would have had the feeling of perhaps being overextended and overwhelmed, it would have been at this point in his ministry. See, so many things were going on as Jesus was increasing in popularity and the crowds were growing. But as the crowds grew, so did the opposition to Jesus. He was once again rejected at his hometown. He faced the charge that he was doing his work by the devil, and enemies grew. And as all that was happening, Jesus also found that he was facing setbacks and hardships. The disciples themselves were at a period and point where they saw the crowds growing around them, and you can understand they probably felt pretty weary. On top of all that, Matthew mentions here that John the Baptizer had just been beheaded by Herod. Imagine the emotional weight and fear and burden that came with that. John was part of the family, a relative of Jesus' side through Mary. No doubt Jesus was probably close. If not, understand that John had been a mentor and forerunner to the Messiah, a mentor to the disciples of Jesus as he had baptized Jesus' disciples, many of them, and led them to Jesus. And the disciples of John, as they heard about his execution, knew that the message was clear. If you follow Christ, and if you point to Christ, that you weren't free from martyrdom. John was the first in the New Testament. And the disciples probably felt the grief and the emotional strain of all this. Adding to that, the disciples had just come back from a mission tour where Jesus sent them across all of Israel. And when they returned, you can probably guess they were feeling pretty weary. And yet Mark records that as they met with Jesus, there were so many in the crowds that they couldn't get a bite to eat. And so they were overextended, overburdened, overworked, and probably feeling overwhelmed. And so Jesus does what any man would do when he sees his crew getting weary and overextended. He invites them to escape from the crowds, withdraw, and go to a solitary place by boat. And Matthew indicates for us their purpose and intent: to be alone. I'm sure that you know what it is to feel overextended and to feel weary and burdened. There's a popular character in a movie that came out named Bilbo, and as he's growing older, he expresses his weariness and feeling overextended. He says he intends to take a vacation, a holiday, and to never come back. And to describe his circumstance, you can tell that he must love food because he says, I feel like butter spread over too much bread. I'm sure the disciples felt like they were like olive oil spread over too much bread. And so Jesus, the same God who said to his people that they were to take a Sabbath rest, says to his disciples here, let's withdraw for a while and let's get away from the crowds and let's get some rest. This is a good reminder. First of all, it shows us too that Jesus himself, the being in very nature true God, humbled himself and grew weary in body. And he himself needed that rest and invited his disciples to experience that rest. And we need that rest. I was kind of reminded of this in a kind of a funny way when I was headed out last month on a family vacation. As I set aside my pastoral duties for a time and spent some time with my family, I was driving away. The streaming music service had picked a song for me on the radio, and it played saying, "You can't save everybody." And it's true, we all have limits. We all need rest. But the disciples found out that planning a getaway doesn't always mean that you get away from the things that make you feel stretched thin. As they arrived on the other side, they saw the crowds had followed them on foot. Matthew records that the crowds had come around and they knew where Jesus was headed. And as you look at the gospel accounts about this, the crowds continued to grow in number. And Jesus' response, when he saw the crowds, yes, he was weary, but the Son of God, though he grew weary, did not weary of loving his people. It says he had compassion on them. And the Son of God, even as he humbled himself and walked in human flesh, could never spread too thin his compassion and love for his people. So it says he taught them and he healed their sick. But by the time the evening hour came, it seems like the disciples were at the end of their rope. They approached Jesus and told him to send the crowds away so they could go get for themselves the food that they need. And what Jesus said in response, I'm sure must have made the disciples feel like they were biting off too much, more than they could chew. Jesus said to them, you don't need to send them away. You give them something to eat. Sounds impossible. Sounds like too much. I'm sure they were feeling overburdened, overextended, overworked, and at this point, far overwhelmed. They approached Jesus and they responded, we have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. We know what it's like to feel overextended and overwhelmed. God's not asking you to feed a crowd of 5,000, but what vocation or calling in life do you have? What about the mother who spends all night staying up with her sick newborn? She doesn't need to hear her 5-year-old say at 6 o'clock in the morning, I'm hungry. And the man who comes back after dealing with so much conflict and a crisis at work doesn't need to come home to find it's on him to fix that leaky faucet. And the person that's operating that charitable organization, when they're struggling to meet their needs, they don't need to hear that their insurance has doubled because of them being in a fire zone. And the congregational chairman who's filling in for the Board of Education that left and moved 2 months ago doesn't need to hear after he's just finished a busy week that there's just one more meeting at church. And you, whatever vocation or calling in life that God has given you, have probably felt that when someone comes to you and they ask for just one more thing. And it seems like that's a good thing, it's a godly thing, but it makes you feel overwhelmed, overextended, and you can't do it. What do we do when we're asked to do just that much more and we're at the end of our rope? We could grow irritable, and we could do what many default to. There are really 2 options that so many default to when this happens. Of course, you could just check out. The other option would be to keep on trucking along and keep on going until you finally crash. And both of those options don't really work, do they? When you're overwhelmed. In fact, when we check out or crash, they're often accompanied by future sinful habits or solutions to avoid feeling overwhelmed. The woman who's tired because her children are so much is told by the world that the solution for her is simply to neglect her children, not be a full-time parent, and maybe even kill the next child before it gets a chance to breathe and come out of the womb. And the man who's so busy and finds that when he comes home he just can't handle the stress is told the solution is to abandon his responsibilities, to abandon his children and his spouse, and yell at his family. In the congregation that's struggling and just has to face one more crisis but just can't make it, or maybe is facing financial hardships and sees the crowds that it can't meet, says, well, it's time to just send the crowds away. And they toss out compassion, and it becomes soon every man for himself, and faith, hope, and love are gone, and the crowds are dismissed. We either check out or crash, and sometimes even adapt in an irritable, sinful way. And what can sadly happen is if we continue in this foolishness, adapting to being overwhelmed in this manner, we can end up actually serving the devil instead of God. Jesus was asking his disciples to do the impossible. Why was he asking them to do this? It's clear he wanted them to see their inabilities. And he wanted them to see the God who always provides and meets all their needs. That they would not be overwhelmed if they would first just listen to what he was asking them to do and trusted in him to provide. I had a mentor when I was training for ministry, and this man told me that ministry would be hard. He said, there'll be times when you're going to feel overworked, overextended, and overburdened. And of course, me being young at that time, probably being overconfident, didn't believe him. And yet I found out, sure, serving is hard. Serving people can make you weary. And yet he made a point to tell me at that time, yet you will not be overwhelmed. That mentor told me that I wouldn't be overwhelmed because he reminded me I'd be serving Christ and doing what he had asked me to do. And I could trust in him to provide everything that was needed to carry out what he had called me to do for each day. So I didn't need to feel overwhelmed. What makes Christians different? Yes, they are at times overextended, overworked, and overburdened. But they never need to be overwhelmed if they listen to what God has placed them in life to do and see what they are called in a godly life to accomplish, and they trust in the Lord to provide. Hadn't God done this before? The same God who had fed perhaps millions, it would seem, in the wilderness for 40 years and gave them bread from heaven. Haven't God done this before, as we read earlier, as the prophet Elijah was given food from ravens to eat? And then Elijah, he learned too later on after that when he went to the widow and she said, I don't have anything to give you. It's impossible to feed you. And Elijah simply told her, bring it here. Trust in God. And he did provide. And so when the disciples, so weary and outworn, were wondering, how can this happen? Jesus said, bring it to me. And they did. And when they brought what little they had, those 5 loaves and 2 fish, Jesus did what we so often fail to do when we have so very little, and we think we don't have enough. He gave thanks and miraculously distributed it to his disciples piece by piece, and they in turn distributed it to the crowd, and everybody had more than they could chew in a good way and were satisfied. And the disciples saw how God, when he provides with abundance, as they picked up those 12 baskets full of leftover pieces. When God provides, he provides. And he calls us to carry out service in his name. You don't need to send the crowds away. Bring it to me. And notice too that the disciples were still involved in this. They still did what Jesus had called them to do, to feed the crowds. Only it wasn't on them to come up with what they needed. They only needed to do what God had asked. And God provided the means for them to carry out their task. They distributed the bread that Jesus gave them. This is how our God works and how he operates. He feeds his people. Jesus didn't get a chance to rest here until after He had taught the crowds, healed the sick, and fed the crowds. And then after that, only after that, did he withdraw and rest. That's how God operates. He will not rest until his people are provided for. Isn't that what he did when he made this world? When he made everything, he did not rest until the seventh day, when his people had all they needed in perfection and holiness. And that's how God operated when his world was overburdened and overwhelmed by the curse of sin. He would not rest until they had what they needed. And it didn't seem like Jesus had much to offer this world. After all, he was only one man, and he only had one life to give. But it was enough. As he poured out his blood and gave his life, he provided for the world to redeem it from the curse. That this world, so often lost under the curse and feeling overwhelmed, would never need to feel so again, because Jesus provided all that we need, making us his own, feeding us with his gospel, giving us not only daily bread, but the promise of everlasting life and a feast with him who lives now forever, that we will live with him forever in his kingdom. God provides. And so now Jesus comes to us, who at times are overextended, maybe even feeling overwhelmed. But then he tells us, reminds us what makes us different as we trust in him. Don't send the hungry crowds away. You give them something to eat. And whatever our vocation or our calling is in life, we carry out what he's given us to do, trusting in him to provide, holding the precious gift of the treasure of the gospel on top of daily bread. And we'll find as we do this that we have more than we can chew, in a good way. Amen. Now may the Lord of peace himself give you peace at all times and in every way. Amen.